Hi.
Hello, thanks for hosting this conference. So should I start now? Yes, I guess I do. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Simeon. We are going to present our research on catastrophic virus. And basically, the question we're asking is like, imagine you're the United Nations and you want to target one or a few countries' policies so that they evolve. Which countries' policies should you target? And so basically, our research question is like, which countries' policies matter most when it comes to when you want to address pandemics? And the key claim we're making is that, contrary to a kind of common belief, a few countries' regulation only and pandemic preparedness measures are playing a disproportionate role to fight pandemics, and especially GCBRs, global catastrophic virus. And these countries are the US, China, France, Germany, and the UK, Russia, Italy, and India. And you can see that these are not poor countries. And the way we come to this conclusion is answering, giving tentative answers to three questions. The first one is, on average, which countries will suffer the most from future pandemics? The second question we're addressing is like, which countries pose the greatest risk for the world via BSL-4 labs? And the third question we're addressing is, if we account for travel ban dynamics, which countries are the most likely to spread viruses?
So most of our results come from running simulations of epidemics, and our simulations have a few main components. First, we have a geographic distribution of the risk of origin of new pandemics. So for instance, there might be a 0.01% chance that a new pandemic originates in the United States in the next year. And then after this distribution of risk, we have an epidemiological model that simulates the course of a pandemic for a given country of origin, so for a given country where the pandemic started. And this model takes into account real travel networks. And later on, we consider also the impact of travel bans on this dynamic. And just to make things clearer, to get our results, for each possible country of origin of a pandemic, we simulate the entire course, well, the course of the pandemic for a given period of time. And then we aggregate the results. So we average out the results of the simulations by weighting each simulation by the relative risk of origin of the country of origin in that simulation. And so imagine that you're mostly worried about risks from naturally occurring pandemics. Then this map shows that on average, after about 10 days of a new pandemic, infections concentrate mostly in Africa. And this is largely because the risk of origin that we're using, the data on risk of origin that we're using, concentrates risk of origin mostly in Africa. So this reflects that at the very early periods, mostly infections are in Africa. But really the striking result is that even if that is the case, at 30 days, most infections are already concentrated in the large and rich countries that we mentioned earlier. And so this means that mostly what determines the outcome of a pandemic a little bit after the first few days is the travel network and who are basically when the pandemic ends up concentrating at the big travel hubs.
So now imagine you're mostly worried about artificial pandemics. And because one reason for that would be that you might expect the worst pandemic to come from engineered viruses or pathogens. And basically, one question you might ask is then, where is it likely that these risks come from? And one important part of the risk might be from lab leaks, in particular BSL-4 labs. BSL-4 labs are the labs who are managing the most important, the most lethal pathogens. And basically, when you look at the concentration of BSL-4 labs, the BSL-3 labs map looks very similarly. You can see that they are concentrated in the same few countries. So there are 11 BSFL labs in the US, there are 6 of them in the UK, 3 of them in France, and 3 in Germany, Italy, China, and India. And so you can see that here, even if you care about mostly about artificial risks, you should be mostly worried about well, these countries. Finally, a last question we're asking is: imagine so when some pathogens are very lethal, you might think that like countries will do travel bans, and that might change the dynamics. So, for instance, imagine there's a very bad pathogen coming from Botswana, and then every countries will cut the travels. And then the question you might ask is, what are the intermediate countries that might help, like might be responsible for the global spread of the pandemic? And so what's again, because of the structure of the global network, because the US or the China or France are connected to roughly every country and with a great volume, the countries, if you account for travel ban dynamics, the countries who are the second biggest spreaders on average of the pandemic are these same countries. And that's what you see on the map. So to conclude, our contribution is that we challenge a belief according to which we should focus our attention on poor countries' policies. And we show that, in fact, we have reasons to believe that a few countries, and they happen to be roughly rich, countries are extremely important on 3 major dimensions. They are very likely to be hit hard by any pandemic. They are very likely to be the origin of most dangerous outbreaks because they concentrate probably the artificial risk, and they are likely to be very important nodes in the global spread dynamic. And so finally, these countries' policies are the ones that matter most, and that's a pretty good news because it's much easier to shift 7 countries' policies than 90 countries' policies, in our opinion. So thanks for listening. We are happy to answer to any question, and if someone has feedback or if someone would be happy to collaborate, feel free to reach out.
Thanks so much. I really find this very interesting. The shift from what's the weakest link in the chain to sort of what's the most connected. What are the most connected links in the chain? Yeah, really interesting. Questions from the room. If no one's immediately wanting to volunteer to put their hand up, I would just be interested if you could. If you would have also considered looking at which countries had significant biological weapons programs in the 20th century, because I imagine it would overlap pretty substantially with the 7 you identified.
Yeah, so we didn't dig that much into that, but you're right that it's likely to overlap. So basically, the one I'm aware about is the USSR, who had one of the greatest bioweapons program. But yeah, as far as I know, there's not a lot of information currently on which which countries are the most active in this domain. I know there were like some attempts to do some OSINT on that, but I don't know if it's fruitful.
Pedro, do you have any thoughts you wanted to add, or?
No, I think that's perfect. Simon's answer.
I just had one question, Abdullahi here. The first point around poorer countries are not the ones very likely to be hit hard by the pandemic. I might have missed the point as to how you got to that conclusion. Could you explain that again?
Yeah, Pedro, if you want, you can.
Yeah, I can go on this one. So basically, it's not. So we aren't here considering sort of vulnerability. So we're not counting hit hard in terms of who will necessarily suffer the most from the pandemic. Basically, what our simulations tell is that on average, so sort of in the expected pandemic, we have most cases, so most infections concentrating around these big countries. So in the beginning, infections will usually concentrate in many poor countries because these according to the data that we have used, are the ones most likely to generate a pandemic. Obviously, it's not so general like this, but overall, this is kind of the statistic that we get. And so in the beginning, these countries are generating the pandemic, but usually cases are concentrating after 30 days in these big countries, the US, Russia, China, and usually countries in Europe as well. So does that answer the question? Or I can, yeah, if you have another question, I can go on.
If you want, just one thing to add is, so for instance, one huge type of effects our model don't capture are economic effects that come in the aftermath of like lockdowns or that kind of stuff. So that for sure mostly hit poor countries. But in fact, when you look just in terms of cases, the countries we mentioned are actually among the top 20 countries on COVID, for instance, except China, who did like very harsh measures. But yeah.